Okay, so I mentioned in a little note in class on Canvas that previously I'd done this tutorial in the past. I had just constrained the placement controller directly to the curve, which meant that the ball was basically submerged halfway through the floor, and then I had to move up the move controller. So I took the approach this time of constraining. Let's click on this. So constraining the ball placement controller with the X and the Z, but left the Y alone. And then it constrained the rotation to follow along there. That worked perfectly so far. I've never done it this way, and it turns out that Maya will not let you swap between constraints where you would add the, swap in and swap out different channels. So once I did the constraint where I did not include the Y, when I added a second weight with that constraint, it wouldn't do it. It wouldn't include the Y. So you might be like, okay, so what's the problem? So I've got my little animation and it lands on top of the pillar here, right? Even can see this in the graph editor at frame 237. It's on its own, and by 238, it lands on the pillar. So at this point, the pillar would be in control. So if it moves, which I want people to try to do, then the ball moves a little bit. So let's go to just any frame after here where it's constrained. And again, there's a tutorial already posted called toggle parent constraint. So in essence, I already followed those steps, and I now have two constraints. If you haven't done this already, and you're not quite sure where this is, that's fine. I'm gonna delete this constraint here in a second and repeat the whole entire process. But if you did follow that tutorial and you get to the point that it is not working, it's actually a pretty quick fix. But let me demonstrate exactly what happens here. So the pillar is set up actually with a couple little locators. So we have one here so that it can pivot on this edge, and we have another so the pillar can pivot on this one, right? Because if it rocks back and forth, this is gonna be that pivot edge. Then the pillar itself is kind of along for the ride. I'm not gonna rotate that because if I rotated that, then the bottom would go through the floor. So let's just take any one of these edges. Let's use the from what I call the front. So you can see that the ball is trying to move with the pillar, but mathematically it just doesn't know how to calculate the Y. So you can see the controller right here, right, is rotating, okay, but it's not doing the Y. If I went back, selected that again, if I did the move constraint, you could see that it's working perfectly with it, right? Because the Y has already been keyframed at this height, and it is just obeying that keyframe. So I apologize for the confusion. Like I say often in class, I always try to do it slightly different or improve upon previous tutorials, but in trying that one method, it just didn't work with our little placement controller. All right, so how to fix that is relatively easy. I'm just gonna do the process over. We could just, I guess the one thing I could do if you already had the pillar constraint in there, if you had followed that tutorial, you could just delete its keyframe. So if I went back, you can see at frame 237, I've put a keyframe here that says, hey, locator 1 is at a value of a weight of 1, and the pillar is a weight of 0, which just means it's not constrained to it. And then it goes to 238, and it switch, it toggles back to pillar being the controller. So I'll just go to 237. Oops, back there. And I'm just gonna delete this constraint. So I'm gonna just leave that as it is. Now, if you haven't done the previous tutorial, then don't worry about it, right? If you're like, oh, all I really have is the locator 1 constraint, I haven't done the other, I'm gonna show you the second part here in a second. Second part here in a second. Nice little sing-song to that. So I'm just going to ignore that constraint. And I did this just as an example because I know some students maybe have done that portion of that. So with that in place, I'll just go back to, so what we're going to do is if I go to the ball rig, and inside of it, there's a group called control. That's where the placement controller is. And so again, we did the the parent constraint to it, but we left the Y translate outside of the constraining, right? And I can't add it in such a way. So what we're gonna do is go up one in the hierarchy. We're gonna just go to the control group, and this is the one that we're gonna put a constraint on. So really what we're gonna do is, for the placement controller, we're gonna animate it so that it goes from 1 to 0, and then this new constraint that I'm gonna put on the control group is gonna go from 0 to 1. So we'll just toggle 1 from on to off, and at the same time, we'll do a separate one that goes from off to on. I hope that makes sense. So again, if you haven't done the other tutorial, this is exactly where I would pick it up. You have animated, you figured out, hey, frame 237 is the frame before it's going to hit the pillar, right? And now become constrained to the pillar, if you want to think of it that way. And then frame 238. So what I'm gonna do is select the placement controller. In fact, no, sorry. I'm going to select the control group. Okay, so when you do constraining, you always select the, in fact, I'm doing it the wrong way. Select the pillar first. So let's go back. So when you do parenting, you always select the child and then the parent, and then you can hit P as the hotkey or manually do it and drag and take the child and make it a parent. When you do constraining, you select the thing that's going to do the controlling, and then the second thing you select is the thing that's going to get controlled, right? So the pillar, I'm selecting the pillar because no matter what I do with the front or the back locators, the pillar is parented to it, right? So that it's along for the ride. So I'm going to choose that as the base of the constraint. So I'll choose that first. And I'm going to hold down Command on the Mac. And I'm going to go over to Control, just so that I get that selected. I'm going to go back up to Constraint, choose the option and Parent. And very important, I'm going to turn on both translate for all, right? And you might want to check your defaults. When we did this before, we had it X and Z the last time I used parent constraint. So this one, I'm just going to say translate all, rotate all, but I am also going to, very important, maintain offset is going to turn on. I don't want this controller to move, right? I want this controller to stay put. In fact, actually, you can't even see it. It would be the same thing here if I was using this placement controller, but the empty group node, which is pivoted right here, we don't want that to move anywhere. We want the ball to stay relative to its current position. All right, so I'll just hit apply, and I can double check. You can see actually in my little outliner, it says control parent constraint. And with that control selected, it's put some keyframe constraint information in here. And I now have pillar weight 1. And this is frame 238, right? So the ball is actually on the pillar. So I want that, right? 1 means 100% in this normalized value system. So 1 would be 100%, and I'm just going to back up 1 frame. And I'm going to turn it to 0. So it's 0%, and I'll put a key on that. Oh, and then the way that we would check that, so maybe if it hits here, I'm just going to do a very quick little animation. Let's say, so I'll just keyframe all those, and what we should see and I probably made this more exaggerated than I wanted, but let's see here. Right, so it hits and it, I didn't do that last little keyframe. 0, key selected, there we go. Right, so you can see the ball is stuck to it. Of course, I can animate the ball moving along with this, but it's the group is what's moving with it. Then I would just use the move controller to deal with that change, right? It's going to be a little bit difficult because we've been animating the rotation of that, but at least its motion itself should be relative to that pillar. Again, maybe in hindsight, I would probably just, in trying to solve a problem at the very beginning, it created a problem at the end. I'm not sure really which one's the worst one to deal with. But anyways, that's the way you can get around the constraint issue. So you're just going to, you've already got the constraint on the placement controller. If you have already followed the other tutorial, which I'm now going to disable, just put this at 0 and delete the keyframes. We'll just leave that one by itself. And then we're going to go back and do the constraint to the control group itself. And now that will be the one that's going to glue it to the pillar. So you just, instead of having one parent constraint with two different objects that are doing the constraining, you're going to have two separate constraints. But it's the same idea of toggling those on and off. All right, hope that helps.